In 1916, a young woman named Septima Poinsette Clark took her first teaching job on Johns Island, South Carolina, paid by the state to teach black children in a school the state wouldn't bother to finish building. The walls had gaps wide enough to see daylight through. She taught 132 students by herself, in 2 shifts, because the county wouldn't fund a second teacher. She would spend the next 4 decades inside a contradiction nobody wrote down anywhere, but every black teacher in the South understood without being told. She was hired to prepare children for a future the system had already decided they weren't allowed to have. That gap between what she was trained to teach and what she was permitted to say runs through almost every part of this story. Some of the rules on this list were written into law, state statutes, no room to argue, the kind of thing you could eventually drag into a courtroom. Some were never law at all, just decisions a school board made because nothing on paper stopped it from making them. And some were never written anywhere, passed teacher to teacher, the way you learn which floorboard in a house creaks, because the only other way to learn them was the hard way, law. Institutional choice, unwritten understanding. Keep those 3 in your head, because by the end, you'll see exactly which of her rules fell into which category, and how one teacher's quiet, careful life on Johns Island ends up rewriting how an entire movement taught itself to read. Number 10. The books with someone else's name crossed out. South Carolina wrote school segregation directly into its 1895 state constitution. By the late 1940s, the gap that was produced was measured in dollars. The average South Carolina school district was spending $221 a year on each white student and $45 on each black one. A new textbook was one of the first things that gap closed off. School boards routinely passed retired textbooks down from white schools to black ones instead. Books already years out of date, spines cracked, pages missing, a white child's name still legible inside the cover where it had been crossed out and replaced. This wasn't a school board cutting corners on its own. It was a state constitution working exactly as designed, and a teacher's first task, before any lesson plan, was simply counting what was missing and building the lesson around it. Number 9. The school that existed because a catalogue company funded it. Between 1912 and 1932, Sears Roebuck president Julius Rosenwald partnered with Booker T. Washington to fund construction of nearly 5,000 schools for black children across the rural South, the Rosenwald schools. Nothing in any state law required a single one of them to exist. Local black communities had to raise matching funds themselves. Land, labor, money, they didn't have to spare, because no statute obligated the state to build them a schoolhouse, and the state, given the choice, mostly didn't. So a teacher learned this before she ever signed a contract. If the building was going to exist, she, or her community, would probably be the one who built it. Number 8. Every contract carried a morality clause. Teaching contracts in this era, for black and white women teachers alike, though enforcement against black teachers was harsher and faster, routinely included written morality clauses. No drinking, no dancing in public, no unchaperoned visits from men, sometimes no marriage at all. School boards wrote these clauses themselves, district by district. No state law required this specific list, and no 2 districts' contracts read quite the same. A teacher learned to read hers twice. Once for what it actually said and once for what enforcing it, selectively, against her in particular, might end up meaning. Number 7. Equal pay was something the law itself withheld. In many southern states, the pay gap between black and white teachers wasn't informal custom. It was built into state-approved salary schedules, on the books, defensible in court because on paper it was the law. In 1940, 2 black teachers in Norfolk, Virginia, Aline Black and Melvin Alston, brought the first major NAACP-backed lawsuit to challenge it. Black was fired before the case could go forward. Alston picked it up and won. A federal appeals court struck the schedule down, and the ruling became the model for equal pay suits across the South over the next decade. Until that ruling existed, a teacher could hold a master's degree, 10 years in the classroom, and a stack of commendations, and still open her pay envelope to a number that had nothing to do with any of it. Number 6. The state decided whose politics were allowed. In 1956, South Carolina passed a law banning state employees, teachers included, from belonging to any civil rights organization, the NAACP by name. Septima Clark refused to resign her membership. The Charleston School Board fired her on the spot, after 30 years of teaching, stripping her of both her job and her pension in a single signature she never had to sign herself. Someone else's pen did that. She hadn't been punished for anything she'd ever said inside a classroom. She'd been punished for what she did on her own time, in her own name, off the clock entirely, and the law made that perfectly deliberately legal. If you've ever wondered how a teacher who just lost everything turned around and became one of the most important literacy organizers of the entire civil rights movement, stay with this one. The second half of this video gets into rules nobody put in any contract, and rule number 1 is the reason most history books get this part of the story backwards entirely. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. So far, every rule in this list has had a paper trail you could go pull yourself. A funding formula, a contract clause, a salary schedule, a statute with a date on it. What comes next is different. These next rules were never written down by anyone, anywhere. No statute required them. No school board voted on them. They were rules a black teacher learned the way you learn where the floor creaks, by living in the house long enough to know. Number 5. 2 curricula, taught in the same hour. State-approved curriculum told black children to know their times tables, their state capitals, the official version of American history. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, founder of North Carolina's Palmer Memorial Institute, taught that curriculum on the surface, and underneath it taught a second one so deliberately she eventually published it as a book. The correct thing to do, to say and to wear, a 1941 guide to exactly the kind of careful self-presentation black students would need once they left her classroom. It's the same instinct caught in the photograph from the start of this video. A collar smoothed flat a half second before the shutter clicks. Brown just turned that instinct into a curriculum with her name on it. Most teachers never wrote theirs down. They just taught it, every day, folded into the lesson so completely that a state inspector sitting in the back of the room never caught it at all. If you'd sat in that back row yourself, you might not have clocked the second curriculum either. That was the point. Number 4. The smartest kid in the class could not look like the smartest kid in the class. Education historian Vanessa Siddle Walker spent years collecting oral histories from the students, teachers, and parents of one segregated school in rural North Carolina for her book, Their Highest Potential. And one pattern that runs through that research, and others like it, is how closely teachers had to manage what white officials were allowed to see. A teacher who let a gifted student answer too quickly, too confidently, in front of the wrong visitor, risked that student, and herself, being marked as uppity, a label with real consequences for school funding and her own job security. So she taught the smartest kid in the room 2 things in the same breath: the right answer, and the patience to wait for the safe moment to give it. If you'd been that kid, you might not have understood why for years. Number 3. The students were watching to see if she was afraid. Former students of segregation-era black teachers, interviewed decades later, described the same thing again and again. They weren't just learning arithmetic. They were watching their teacher's face for fear. A teacher who flinched when a white official walked in, taught the room something no textbook ever would. A teacher who didn't teach something else entirely. Fear wasn't the only thing she had to keep off her face. Anger worked the same way. The printed morality clause back at number 8 covered drinking, dancing, visitors, not temper. But every teacher knew the unwritten version anyway. No visible anger. No argument with a white person caught by the wrong pair of eyes. No expression a colleague's firing hadn't already taught her to read as dangerous. This is the moment the job stopped being about lesson plans at all. It became about what a steady face, held in front of a room of children, could teach that no curriculum, written or unwritten, ever could. Number 2. Building the thing the state wouldn't. After being fired in Charleston, Septima Clark didn't stop teaching. She scaled it up. Working with longshoreman and community organizer Esau Jenkins on Johns Island, she helped build the citizenship schools, informal classrooms held in the back of a store or someone's kitchen, teaching adults to read well enough to pass the literacy tests. Southern states used to block black voters from registering. By the time the program was absorbed into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it had trained organizers who started similar schools across the South. Thousands of new voters, taught by a woman the public school system had just finished discarding. Nobody had to teach her this one. It was the same rule every teacher on this list had already been living by, just turned up to its loudest possible volume. If the institution won't build the thing, you build it yourself, off whatever books you actually have. And here's the part of this story that should read like a victory lap, and doesn't. Number 1. The movement lost its teachers right when it needed them most. You'd expect that when Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregated schools in 1954, it was an unambiguous win for the very teachers who'd spent decades fighting for equal funding and equal pay. It wasn't. And the first sign came before the ruling was even decided. In 1953, a black teacher named Darla Buchanan received a letter from the school superintendent in Topeka, Kansas, the very city Brown versus Board is named after, explaining that if the court struck down segregation, white families likely wouldn't want a black teacher in front of their children. The letter closed with a single line: "Your services will not be needed for next year." It survives today in the National Archives. What happened to Buchanan herself in the years after isn't fully documented in the public record. What is documented is that the warning in that letter became reality for thousands of others nationwide. Nothing in the Brown ruling itself forced a single district to fire a single black teacher. It said schools had to integrate, not who had to lose their job when they did. But as southern districts integrated, often only under federal pressure, white school boards overwhelmingly chose, district by district, to keep white teachers and let black teachers go. For decades, the figure historians cited was roughly 35 to 38,000 black teachers and principals displaced in the 2 decades after Brown. A notice on a door, a set of keys turned in, a classroom somebody else would teach in by 4, repeated tens of thousands of times across the South. In 2022, education scholar Leslie Fennick went back to the original congressional testimony behind that number and found it had been undercounted. By her count, the real figure is closer to 100,000. The ruling that was supposed to end the underfunded, second-hand locally decided system these women had spent their careers fighting was followed by the most damaging decision in this entire story. And it wasn't a decision the law made at all. It was one school boards made, on their own, because the ruling left them free to. 10 rules, 3 categories, and by now you've probably already sorted a few of them yourself. 3 were laws, the state constitution that produced those second-hand textbooks, the salary schedule Aileen Black and Melvin Alston sued over, the membership ban that cost Septima Clark her pension. Each one had a date, a statute, a case file, and each one fell on its own separate timeline. The salary law fell first to a federal court in 1940. The segregation funding law fell next to Brown versus Board in 1954. And the South Carolina case folded into that ruling. Briggs versus Elliott was built on exactly the funding gap that put second-hand textbooks in her hands in the first place. The same $221 to $45 divide from the top of this list. The membership ban law outlived them both, who fought separately, years later. They didn't all fall at once, and they didn't all fall to the same ruling. But each one, eventually, had a specific target you could actually point a lawsuit at. 3 were institutional choices. A state that never built the schools, a contract clause a district wrote into its own paperwork, and a wave of firings after Brown that no statute ever required. None of these had a single law behind them, which is exactly why none of them had a single court date that ended them either. A district could comply with every word of Brown and still choose quietly who kept a job and who didn't. And 4 were never written anywhere at all. The second curriculum folded inside the first one. The timing a gifted student learned to wait for, the steadiness a teacher held in front of a room of frightened children, the instinct to build the thing yourself when nobody else would. These didn't end with a court ruling because they were never tied to one in the first place. They just kept getting taught, teacher to teacher, long after the laws around them had changed. Every one of these women checked a collar, a hem, a crease, the same way, every single morning. Not because anyone white was watching, but because they'd decided, long before any of them ever stood in front of a classroom, exactly how they intended to carry themselves through a world built to diminish them. The same hand that smoothed the child's collar in that first photograph had spent a lifetime smoothing her own first. That decision was its own unspoken rule, maybe the first one any of them ever learned. Septima Clark spent her last working years being called, by the people who fired her, a troublemaker. By the time she died in 1987, Martin Luther King Jr. had called her the mother of the movement, and the literacy program she built out of a kitchen table had helped put tens of thousands of new names on Southern voter rolls. The gap between what she was hired to teach and what she actually believed never closed during her career. It just kept widening, until the work she did in the space between the two outlasted the job that tried to contain it. Next time, 10 unspoken rules. Every 1950s black flight attendant followed, a job that didn't even exist for black women until 1958, and the woman who broke that door open first. If this kind of history doesn't make it into your textbooks, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, and we'll keep finding it.